Okay, so this lecture looks at the Battle of Hattin, some of the reasons why it was such a disaster for the Latin Christians, and then sort of how events unfold afterwards. This is a quote from William of Tyre. So we've talked about William of Tyre before, and this is towards the very end of his lifetime. And you can see that he is very well aware that things are not going well for the Crusader states. In particular, the infighting is causing so much instability, and that is sort of happening at the same time as this real unification unfolds on the side of the Muslims under Nur al-Din and then Salah ad-Din. So the immediate cause of Hattin, Raymond of Chatillon, who was the Prince of Antioch, is now, through a different marriage, the Lord of Outrejourdan. And so he controls a lot of strategic territory in the south of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So Raymond of Tripoli, as regent, had negotiated a 5-year truce with Salah ad-Din, Raymond on the side of avoiding sort of large-scale confrontation. And recognizing that the situation in the Kingdom of Jerusalem with this uncertainty about succession did not put them in a position of power. So in 1187, Renaud, who is not happy with Raymond's sort of position on this, they wanted a more aggressive sort of approach to conflict with Salah ad-Din. Renaud seizes a caravan, a Muslim caravan, that's moving goods from Egypt into more of the central sort of areas of Salah ad-Din's territory. And there are a lot of goods. There's a lot of wealth in this caravan. There's also people. So Renaud seizes the caravan in violation of the truce. Salah ad-Din appeals to Raymond to get Renaud to return the goods and prisoners, but Renaud refuses. And so this is Renaud's fortress in Kerak, which is sort of his base of operations. There's also sort of the bigger picture, though. Salah ad-Din recognizes that he is in an ideal position to make sort of a major move against the forces of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And so in many ways, things have been sort of moving towards this confrontation, and some of his allies think that it is time. And so this gives him sort of justification for ending the truce with Raymond and leading his forces into the kingdom. And so when King Guy hears about Salah ad-Din's forces on the march, he musters every able-bodied man he can find. Raymond of Tripoli raises his army, and they all sort of together camp at a place called Sephoria or Safaria in the Arabic. It's an ideal location. It has pasture for their horses. It has access to fresh water, which is key because this is summertime in the middle of the desert. They have about 1,200 knights on horseback and about 15,000 infantrymen. In contrast, Salah ad-Din is camped at Kafr Sabt. He has maybe not as many as 30,000 men, but certainly more than the forces of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He also has access to sources of water. What he wants to do is draw Guy's army out and make him sort of leave this favorable position. So what he does is he seizes the city of Tiberias. He lays siege to Tiberias. Tiberias surrenders. However, this is the citadel in Tiberias. One of the reasons why he attacks Tiberias is because it's where Raymond of Tripoli's wife Ashiva is. And Ashiva takes refuge in the citadel. When they are informed about the siege of Tiberias, Raymond is actually not terribly concerned because he believes the citadel is strong enough to withstand the siege. So he says to Guy, don't fall for this, don't go, don't leave your position. It would be foolish. Initially, they have like sort of a council during the day. Guy listens to Raymond, but then they sort of break up for the night. Guy then has conversations with Gerard de Ridefort, who is the Grand Master of the Templars, and also Renaud of Chatillon, who advise a much more sort of aggressive response to the siege of Tiberias. So when everyone wakes up on the morning of July 3rd, they found that Guy has changed the plan of attack, and he's ordered a march on Tiberias. However, as the army begins to head in that direction, they discover that Salah ad-Din has planned for this. He's drained all the cisterns along the way. So they march for hours in this hot sun with no water. They also have sort of small contingents of Muslim archers positioned along the hills, so sort of harassing the army as it marches, and using bows and arrows to sort of inflict damage. They also set fires. There's a westerly wind, and so the wind blows the smoke directly into the face of the already dehydrated crusaders. And then eventually, the crusaders, as it starts to get darker, realize they're not going to make Tiberias. So they know they need a source of water. And so what they hope to do is avoid Salah ad-Din's army and head towards Hattin. They're not going to get to Hattin either. So Guy begins to make camp in a very unfavorable location. Shortly after that, they are surrounded by Salah ad-Din's army as they get close to Hattin. We're not exactly sure what happens with Raymond's forces. You can kind of see from this map, Raymond was at the front of the march. There are a few different accounts of what happens. He says he sort of didn't realize what was happening when they were attacked by the Muslims until it was too late. There are other sort of accounts that perhaps he fled. We just don't know. But we do know is that Raymond of Tripoli, with a very small number of men, does not engage at Hattin. He returns to Tripoli. The rest of the army fights fiercely, but they're just overwhelmed. And the conditions of the march have sort of depleted their forces. Guy Renaud and the Grand Master of the Templars, along with a lot of other members of the military orders and a lot of other leading nobles of the kingdoms, are captured. They lose the True Cross. And the infantry then, many of them are enslaved, and most of the noble knights then are ransomed. The exception, however, is Renaud. So this is a contemporary illustration of Saladin beheading Renaud himself. The story that we have from Muslim chroniclers is that Guy and the Grand Master, the Knights Templar, and Renaud are brought before Saladin. Saladin acknowledges that Guy is a king, so he respects his position. He offers him some water. Guy takes the water. Then Renaud seizes the water from Guy, and Saladin says, "I did not offer that to you," and he beheads him on the spot. Guy is going to be kept prisoner for several months. Gerard de Ridderfort is kept prisoner as well until he's ransomed, and then most of the other nobles will eventually find their way back home as well. So obviously the consequences of Hattin are extremely negative for the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem, because Guy mobilized almost every able-bodied man he could find under his command. There are no defenses left throughout the kingdom. So their forces are just unable to resist the pressure. So Salah ad-Din is able to capture all of these Frankish strongholds one by one. So Acre, Ascalon, Beirut, Sidon, and also Jaffa. These are city-states, many of them along the coast, that the Franks had spent decades trying to capture. And this reversal happens very, very quickly. You can see from this illustration here, in particular, sort of illustrating the brutality of the fight, but also this is when they lose the True Cross. And then Guy is imprisoned in Damascus, and in 1187 then, Salah ad-Din lays siege to the city of Jerusalem itself. So for all intents and purposes, Jerusalem is defenseless. It's not able to muster much resistance at all. Queen Sibylla is in Jerusalem, and the other person who is in Jerusalem is this guy, Balian of Ibelin. The more accurate portrayal of him is at the top, as opposed to the Orlando Bloom portrayal in Kingdom of Heaven, which is really inaccurate. Balian was captured after Hattin. He did have sort of a relationship with Salah ad-Din. They had negotiated back and forth on occasion. Balian asked permission to return to Jerusalem to escort his wife and his family outside of the city. Salah ad-Din gave him permission with conditions. You can only stay within the city walls for one night, and you have to promise never to bear arms against me. Balian agreed to these conditions, but when he returned to Jerusalem and he saw the population and how defenseless they were, he realized that he had to do something to try and secure their safety. So what happens is Saladin has the city surrounded. Balian demands safe passage for all the Latin Christians within the city. Saladin refuses. And so what Balian says is, if you don't negotiate, I will kill all the Muslims who are in the city, and I will destroy every single Muslim holy site that's within the city. And so this, along with his desire to be fair, leads Saladin to agree that they can ransom as many Latin Christians as they have funds to do so. So most of the sort of wealthier merchants, lower level nobles are able to sort of pay for their freedom. Balian and Sibylla sort of deplete every source of funds they can find within the city, and they're able to raise the ransom funds for about 7,000 of Jerusalem's poorest people. There are probably some who they're not able to ransom, who stay within the city walls, and ultimately then when Saladin takes control of the city, they end up as slaves. So the city surrenders. The Greek Christians remain, and many of them are actually quite happy to do so. They prefer Muslim control to the control of Latin Christians because of the competition and tension. Saladin also encourages the return of many of the Jews who'd been expelled earlier. He restores, so there were a lot of Muslim shrines that were converted to Christian shrines. He returns them to Muslim shrines. The exception is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which he leaves Christian. And then in the absence of the former capital of Jerusalem, the royal court moves its capital to the city of Tyre, which is pictured here on the coast. It's one of the few that they still have control of. So in addition to the loss of Jerusalem, then sort of shockwaves sort of reverberate across Western Europe and are going to be sufficient to sort of motivate the organization of a new crusade. In the meantime, however, you continue to have division amongst the leaders of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So Conrad of Montferrat is a noble from around Italy. Conrad comes to Tyre and sort of asserts his authority. He has a number of resources. He is the brother of William of Montferrat, who had been married to Sibylla. So there's sort of a relationship there. In the meantime, Guy is freed. He joins his wife Sibylla and their daughter in Tripoli. They attempt to join the rest of the royal court in Tyre, but when they get to Tyre, Conrad will not let them in the city. So he has ambitions of his own, and he is very suspicious of Guy's attempt to assert his leadership. In the meantime, Pope Gregory VIII issues another call for a crusade. He particularly puts a lot of pressure on Henry II of England and Philip II of France. The way they understand the fall of Jerusalem is that it is the result of all of the sins, not just of the people in Jerusalem, but of Christians across Western Europe. Everyone has sinned, and so they're being punished, and Jerusalem is being taken away from them. So he calls for a penance for everybody for all of their sins. He issues sort of requirements of a European-wide fast every Friday, no meat on Saturday to join the already sort of meatless Sunday. And so as sort of this collective responsibility for events. So while Henry II is the King of England who is targeted initially by the Pope, there's civil war in England. He's fighting with his children. He takes the cross. He pledges to go, but he dies before he can. His son Richard succeeds him. There's a sort of a delay during sort of the period when Richard then is crowned King of England. Eventually, though, he is able to organize his departure. Richard is known as an extraordinarily capable military leader. He has a proven record of fighting already. And he's also very much committed to the idea of Jerusalem and crusade. He is very well resourced. Henry II had begun raising funds for his own crusade in the form of what he called a Saladin tithe, so a 10% property tax levied across the board in England, which raised a lot of money. Richard advocates a faster naval route to the Latin East. He does have to take a brief detour to the island of Sicily, where his sister is. And then there's also a brief tour to the island of Cyprus, which there's infighting. He becomes involved and he ends up capturing the island of Cyprus as well. But after those brief moments, he does land outside the city of Acre. The second major leader of the crusade is Philip II. Philip II also sort of bowed to the pressure of the Pope, though much more reluctantly. What he really wanted was he wanted a divorce. And so the Pope said, look, if you go on crusade, I'll give you your divorce. He was able to bring about 650 knights, about 5,000 foot soldiers, and a considerable amount of provisions. One of the reasons why he was a reluctant participant is because, as you can see from this map, at this moment, on the eve of the crusade, the kings of England controlled all of this sort of reddish, orangish territory in France. Philip did not like that sort of situation, and he saw Richard's absence as an opportunity for him to begin reconquering some of this territory. In the meantime, however, he is on crusade. He lands near Acre. He does become very ill. A number of the crusaders do as well. There's some sort of fever that's spreading through the camp. A lot of them also suffer from scurvy. This is sort of a very high fever with periods where you're sort of delusional. And so we do know that Philip does get quite sick. So does Richard, actually. Richard gets very sick as well, though he is sort of much less inclined to sort of see that as a sign that the crusade needs to end. The third person is Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor. He is sort of advanced in years, but he has always sort of intended to go on crusade, but events at home prevented him from doing so. He has about 15,000 men. They're going to take a land route through Hungary and then down through Constantinople. Unfortunately, the march ends up being much more arduous than they had anticipated. In particular, even though it's sort of early summer, it's unusually warm. You also have the runoff from the mountains, so the streams are higher than usual. On June 10th, so shortly after their departure, they need to cross the river Salif. The current is stronger than it should be this time of the year. They think they find a place where they can ford the river. Frederick sort of enters the water on horseback, and he gets swept away by the current and he drowns. And this is an illustration of Frederick attempting to cross the river here. In the aftermath of his death, many of his troops they're despondent. He was very well liked. There's no longer sort of this desire to continue on this crusade. So most of his troops return home. A handful of them continue on under the leadership of the Duke of Swabia. So in the meantime, while Richard and Philip are sort of organizing their forces to take the city of Acre, Sibylla and her daughter have also become sick of whatever this fever is that's circulating, and she dies in 1190. Obviously, she was the daughter of Amalric, so she was the queen of Jerusalem undisputed. However, the connection to her husband Guy as king is now very tenuous. He was only king through her. They don't have any surviving children together. So now that she's gone, what right does he have to exercise authority? And after Hattin, he's already sort of operating from a position of weakness. So Conrad of Montferrat steps in. He annuls the marriage of Isabella. So Isabella is King Amalric's daughter with his second wife. So she is next in line to succeed. Conrad has her marriage annulled. She's still only about 12 or 13. He then marries her. Once they're married and it's consummated, they can't be separated. It's considered legitimate. So then Guy realizes that there's not much he can do. He agrees that he will continue to be king until his death, and then Conrad and Isabella will succeed him. Shortly after that, however, Guy does also become sick and he dies. And then shortly after that, Conrad becomes the victim of an attack by the Nizari, the assassins. And so Conrad is also killed. So Isabella is still the queen, but obviously there really is no one in a position of authority sort of making these decisions on behalf of the Crusader kingdoms. So in 1191, Richard and his forces are able to capture the city of Acre. He negotiates some terms with Salah ad-Din for the release of all the people inside the city. There are quite a few Muslims in the city. Salah ad-Din still has some captives left from Hattin and some of the other encounters, so they agree to sort of a prisoner exchange. We're not exactly sure what happens, but we know that Richard is frustrated because he feels like Salah ad-Din is not releasing those prisoners as timely as he thinks. And so in sort of an instance of rage, he executes about 2,700 Muslim captives. This sort of creates a temporary period of hostility between these two forces. In the meantime, Philip, who has recovered from his illness, but says he's just not feeling 100%, says he's going to return to England. He leaves his men and all the resources with Richard, and he does swear an oath that he will not mess with any of Richard's possessions back in Europe. So then Richard, now that he has control of the city of Acre and a base of operations, turns his attention to Jerusalem. He does make several attempts to attack the city. He does construct some siege equipment, but it's not super effective. In part, he can't get close to the city. The wells around the city for miles are poisoned, so they have to go really far to find sources of fresh water. They can't sort of camp outside the city the way the first Crusaders did. There are several small skirmishes with Salah ad-Din's forces, in which Richard is victorious, though they're not decisive. And over the course of time, sort of armies on both sides increasingly become depleted. Richard also hears word that Philip, in spite of that oath, is conspiring with Richard's younger brother John to take control of his possessions in France and England. So he realizes that he needs to return. And increasingly, they are running out of provisions and they are running out of resources. This is a contemporary illustration of Richard jousting against Salah ad-Din. Richard and Salah ad-Din had a very cordial relationship. They negotiated on a number of occasions. They both respected each other's sort of military prowess and leadership quite a bit. And so, comparatively speaking, Western Christian writings about Salah ad-Din are actually fairly sort of admirable in their tone. Ultimately, then, what Richard decides is if he throws everything he has at the city of Jerusalem, and if he's willing to stay the course indefinitely, he could probably take the city, but he could not hold the city. He just doesn't have the resources or the manpower. So instead, he agrees to the Truce of Jaffa. So this is supposed to last for 3 years and 8 months. They will acknowledge Salah ad-Din's control of the city of Jerusalem and areas outside of it. In return, Salah ad-Din will guarantee safe passage for any Christian pilgrim who wants to visit the city, as long as they're unarmed. So the Franks then control some territory along the coast. This includes Acre, Tyre, and Jaffa. They move their capital to Acre, in part because it's a sort of a more favorable location. And in 1192, Richard departs and he returns to his kingdom in Europe to deal with the affairs there. And then shortly after that, Salah ad-Din himself dies. So ultimately, Third Crusade, more successful than the second, not nearly as successful as the first, but is going to provide some sort of key learning points moving forward for some of the later Crusades to come.